let us know. If you are having technical difficulties like hearing, or if all of a sudden our audio goes out, you can use the chat feature to let us know that. There it is, exactly an example of if other people are having problems hearing us. We are turning up our speaker volume now. All right. This is the clicker for that. Yeah. So here, I'll have Ellen move in here. Great.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ellen Bodler. I am the supervisor of the Housing Access Programs at the ARC Minnesota. And today we're talking about housing access services.
You should hit the little arrow up here.
Click here?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
We just ran into a technical difficulty.
Yeah, do you want to try them out?
Okay.
Where did you click? I just clicked right there. I know, but done.
Okay, now we're on. So Housing Access Services was started in July of 2009. Originally, it was a contract between the ARC Minnesota and DHS Disability Services Division. In 2018, it was converted into DH Housing Division. It was started to help bridge the gap for people with disabilities that wanted more of a choice where they could live. Specifically, we were very interested in moving people out of congregate settings, such as group homes and other more institutional settings, into homes of their own, where they could bring their disability services with them and have more control over who was their disability service providers. Housing Access Services was needed to help with navigating housing searches, searching for housing, filling out applications, negotiating with landlords, negotiating the lease, and most importantly, and somewhat uniquely to HAS, we were given funding to help address the financial burden of one-time moving-related costs. HAS started out serving people, so this is back in 2009, serving people who were currently then eligible for the various waivers, as you can see on your screen, as well as medical assistance home care services, such as PCA, PCA Choice, private duty nursing, ARMS, or SILS. Currently, we have seen a change, both in demographics and in the scope of the program. HAS has been changed to exclusively work with people who are receiving medical assistance, and you must be eligible, and the key word is eligible, for a medical assistance home care service, because it was changed, I believe, in 2016, that people who had eligible waivers were then switched to the program called Housing Access Coordination, which is a billable waiver service. So since then, we have seen our demographics change in the contract called HAS. We've been receiving many more ARMS individuals than in the beginning, and part of this is due to our outreach with PCA and ARMS service agencies, especially once the people with waivers were moved into Housing Access Coordination. the ARC started providing HAC in July of 2017. HAC was largely modeled on the HAS program. So they do provide essentially the same services. The one major difference is that Housing Access Coordination does not have funds in and of itself in the program to provide assistance with the one-time rental costs. Fortunately, very recently, Transitional Services has been expanded to allow people with vouchers to access transitional services even if they're moving from and into an unlicensed setting. In addition to the changing demographics, the contract itself has changed, particularly regarding restrictions on where people can live. Originally, HAS started with the idea that people should only live in independent housing, and that was interpreted in the beginning as settings that have less than 7 people total in the building or in the development who have disabilities. In addition, we were not allowed to move people into private provider-controlled, leased, or owned housing. This also, as interpreted in the beginning, included no public housing high-rises because of the 7-person limit rule as interpreted by DHS. And this was very limiting for people that needed more affordable housing. I think it's important to note how much the housing market has changed. Back when the contract started, it was, believe it or not, possible to find efficiency apartments for $400 a month. So people who had the 750 SSI and SNAP could, find a way to make that work. Now, currently, the average price for a studio is easily in the 900s. One bedrooms typically are at 1,000. So that change has really put pressure on, I think, everybody trying to help low-income people and low-income people with disabilities really look at how it was limiting people in terms of their choice for housing. Also coming into play were the standards in the Olmstead Plan that really focused on people getting to live where they want and with whom they want, and that ran into the tension, of course, with the long-held belief that we don't want people with disabilities to be congregated and segregated from the community. We now have in our contract that people can move to independent housing where they want as long as the building is not provider controlled. And I think that what that means is that we don't move people into group homes. We can't move people into assisted living. We do, however, now move people into public housing, into Section 8 housing, if that's where they want to live, and it's not provider controlled. Can everybody make sure they're muted?
Please make sure your phone is on mute.
Okay, so if everyone can make sure you have a muted phone. One thing about HAS that's very important and is, I think, important to point out, part of the flexibility of this contract that the ARC has with DHS is that we can also step in if people have found their own housing. It's not the case that you can only get assistance with a deposit if we found you a place to live. If you were able to find the housing on your own, we still are able to assist with that. We feel that that is very person-centered, meeting the person where they are at in their journey to finding housing. Some of the things we can do include helping them to figure out and meet with their team about independent living, budgeting if they want that help, filling out their application, bring them to the Section 8 office if they have a voucher, coordinate paperwork, go to the apartment with the landlord, coordinate moving trucks and packing. We do not move people ourselves, but we do have a very good mover who is very good at dealing with people who have disabilities, and we hire them and can help pay for that. We also can help pay for furnishings, bridging referrals, and or a security deposit. I really need to emphasize that at this time, our funding capacity is very low. We are essentially out of funds probably until February, and then those will be limited. One thing about the limited funds is that there are often other ways to get those one-time rental costs. If you haven't or your client hasn't used emergency services from their county in the last year, it's a very good place to try. There are a lot of requirements that the county has, but we have had a lot of success with that. So the question of how we find rental properties, we get often asked, do you have like a magic list or a secret list that you have of places that no one else knows about? And the answer is no, although I really wish that was true. We do a lot of online searching. And, you know, there isn't any secret to that. Housing Link, of course, especially dealing with subsidized housing. Rent411apartments.com. Community websites, Craigslist. We have to be very careful, but a lot of people go on Craigslist that have lower priced units. The Senior Housing Guide can be very helpful for people who are seniors. And we do keep a list and keep in touch with past landlords or connections that we have out in the community. And we've been building those connections for 9 years now. Leasing companies also have their own websites, and that can be very important. So we have some questions. I'll take a second.
Well, first off, there will be a PowerPoint available after this presentation, but there is a question about if someone who wants housing access services can someone who wants housing access services move into a customized living setting, or is that considered a duplication of services?
So you're asking about housing access coordination, and my understanding is that housing access coordination is very strict about it not being provider-owned, leased, or controlled. So a customized living setting, if the services are provided by the owner of the building and controlled by the owner of the building, that would be, I don't know if I could say it was a duplication of services. I think it certainly would be, but it also would just not even be allowed to take place under housing access coordination. After we found a couple of places that are renting, we start calling the apartment complexes and seeing if they have openings. So a lot of what we do is it's really a lot of legwork. And we have offices, housing offices at the ARC locations in Moorhead, Duluth, Rochester, St. Cloud, and Mankato. So it is a statewide program. I have to say the whole state is experiencing a very tight rental market, but the Twin Cities, and to some extent Duluth and Rochester, are really, really, really tight. One thing that we have found can work, although it's very labor intensive, is we just start driving around and writing down addresses and property management companies. A lot of the naturally occurring affordable housing apartments don't advertise even on Craigslist. They put out a sign on their property. They tend to be older buildings. A lot of them seem to have been built in the 60s and 70s. We write down their names and numbers and call, or sometimes we even go into the office to try to find what it is they have available. In the outstate area, we really end up doing this a lot because a lot of the outstate landlords do not advertise online. So it depends on where you're looking. There can be advertisements in community newspapers, especially outstate, in the main paper, on community walls at stores and coffee shops. That doesn't happen very much in the metro, but it still can happen outstate. So I want to spend some time talking about how to overcome housing barriers. And this is, in this market, has become really challenging, and the barriers are more significant in affecting the outcome of an application. Negative histories can be a rental barrier, and so you have to think about how do we get around those negative histories. We start out with working with the landlord so they understand our program. And I think overall the main thing I would say is that we have found the most success if we present our client in kind of a whole way so that the landlord isn't just looking at their background check, but they have information up front about the client, about what the client's been through, and most importantly, if they have a negative history, what has changed since the history, why things have changed, and then also how going forward there will be supports or services in place to ensure a successful tenancy. One thing we run into a lot in this market is the property owner's income guidelines. And that can be it can kind of stop you in your tracks, but you can try to get around that by working with the property owner to set up direct deposits, or tell them that the income, like if they're on SSDI or SSI, is a steady, permanent source of income, and it will not depend on whether the person is employed. I think the most important thing, having been involved in property management before, is to encourage landlords to look at the fact that the person has always paid their rent, regardless of the fact that they are on SSI, and that history should be weighted more heavily than the amount of their income. Income guidelines that at a property that accepts Section 8 or other vouchers, I think it's very important to argue to the property owner that their income guidelines should be based on the portion of rent actually paid by the tenant, which is 30 to 40% of their income, and not on the total rent charged. Because if you're using a voucher or other subsidy, they are guaranteed that 70% every month, and you might as well not say you're taking a voucher if you were going to say someone needs $2,500 or $3,000 a month in income to use their voucher. We run into people who refuse to do that, and so I think it's safe to say that they've gotten legal advice that says that you must treat everyone the same in your income guidelines, and that is not true. And I think if the property owner refuses to bend on the guidelines, if you're trying to get someone housing with a voucher, one thing we need to explore, and we are just started exploring this, is making a request for a reasonable accommodation under the American with Disabilities Act, and asking the landlord to suspend that income guideline because the person's income is what it is because of a disability, and that you can then do other things that will reassure the landlord the rent will be paid, like I mentioned before. A negative housing history can be difficult to overcome. They can't hear us. Can you hear us at all? Because I'm right by the speaker.
Oh, see our chat. Yeah, so some of us, sounds like the audio may be a issue on not our end, it sounds like. So apologies, but.
I've been told that if you are listening over the computer and you're having a hard time hearing, that you can like close the window and open it back up and try to get back in. Sometimes the connection slows down and the sound stops going through, or use the call-in.
There's an option to use your phone to call in with the number, right?
Yeah.
And then when you first join in, so you may want to try that too.
Okay, so back to evictions and unlawful detainers. If they're recent, this can be a really big barrier. I think the best thing to do is to present the facts of the eviction in the application process prior to the background check. There are a couple of ways to approach this. If the unlawful detainer was the result of an inability to pay rent, then there are things like finding a less expensive unit and pointing out why the tenant will be able to pay the amount, setting out, what was going on in their lives that made them unable to pay, and pointing out how those circumstances are different. And we often run into people who have unlawful detainers because they just couldn't afford the unit, and now they have either some kind of voucher or their name has come up on project-based Section 8. And it's really a powerful argument, I think, to those landlords specifically, that their inability to pay their prior rent is exactly why they need to be in subsidized housing, which is what they're asking to move into. You can also get a rep payee, especially when you're dealing with people with negative histories, and they can assist with making the landlords a little more comfortable because there's another person there to ensure they get paid. Direct payments are another way of doing this. Setting up a rep payee if you have a history of late rental payments. The rep payee can also help if there's a history of non-payment or a bad credit history. I think that tenants tend to underestimate how negative it is viewed when they pay late. I've been doing this a really long time, and I don't think people understand how upset that makes the landlord if you're late with your rent. And so a rep payee or direct deposit can maybe get you past a history of late rental payments. putting the situation about the UD into context can be very helpful. And also look into seeing if it's something that may be expunged. And we've been partnering with the Volunteer Lawyers Network when looking at expungement due to criminal history and unlawful detainers. And it currently also, in anticipation of the upcoming legislative session, Homes for All, which is a coalition of advocacy organizations that are working to increase affordable housing and tenancy protections, will be presenting a platform of tenant protections, and one of them is trying to limit the number of years that an unlawful detainer can remain on a record. And also there have been some efforts to get counties to provide assistance to people who want to try to get an expungement. Okay. Again, if there's a negative history, a UD or a bad credit history, I think this includes a criminal history also. It's really important before the background check happens to show the landlord the person has made changes in their lives. And it's a lot of work up front, but I think it makes a big difference because then they're starting to think about the applicant as the person that they are and not just, you know, one of the hundreds that are applying. So if you have a client who has had treatment and changed their lives, get letters of reference from healthcare professionals. Their arms worker can write a letter, their PCA about how responsible they've been in taking care of themselves, the history of AA or another program. If they have a criminal record, if you can get a letter that they are in compliance with their probation from the probation officer, that makes a big difference. And showing that they paid their rent on time since the unlawful detainer, and that they've been consistent with their other bills. If a person's applying for subsidized housing, either project-based or voucher, I make the argument to the landlord that credit scores should not be an obstacle. People who are very low income tend to have very low credit scores because they haven't been able to pay their bills. And if they can get affordable housing, then that can really turn around for them. So more about negative history, criminal history. Depending on the type of charge and the date of occurrence, this can greatly affect the success of a test for application. So we get, in addition to what I just mentioned, letters from transitional housing, halfway houses, sober living, parole officers, treatment programs. We also spend a lot of time talking to our clients about how to meet with the landlord and helping them to draft a letter talking about their past criminal history. And I mean, I think the best letters lay out what it is that happened, and the best letters are taking responsibility for what they're responsible for, and again, pointing out how things have changed since. So, that's it for the PowerPoint. I'm certainly open to questions. I can answer questions about HAS or HAC.
right. We're getting this up. All right. Read it.
Yeah, so the question is, does a person receiving R79 mental health case management services but not a waiver qualify for this service? If so, how do we refer? No, mental health case management is not qualify you for HIS. But ARMS Services does qualify you, and ARMS Services is the easiest qualifying service that you can get because you can self-refer to ARMS. And if you're eligible for mental health case management services, in all likelihood you'll be eligible for an ARMS worker. And remember that our criteria is that you must be eligible for this service. The reason that we have the word eligible rather than receiving a service is that we deal with a lot of people who are homeless, and a lot of the services that would make them eligible for our program are discontinued when someone's homeless. But if they're eligible, then we can assist them. And how to refer, you would call the Metro ARC office at 952-915-3632. And I do all the intake, which is not a real long process, but there's some key information we need to get. And I can talk to the referral person, and then we, of course, always contact the individual. Is there a difference between HAC and HAS is the next question, and yes, there is. HAC is for people who have waivers, and that includes the brain injury waiver, the CADI waiver, the DD waiver, the CAC waiver, and that's it. It does not include the elderly waiver, and it does not include the alternative care waiver. But the services provided under the two programs are pretty much identical. If you qualify for HAC, in that you have one of the waivers I just listed, you will also be qualifying for transitional services as long as you're moving into independent housing that's not provider controlled or owned or leased. And transitional services, you have up to $3,000 per client to assist you with the runtime rental costs. Under HAS, to be eligible, you must have medical assistance, you cannot have a waiver, and you must be eligible for a medical assistance home care service, and then also we include ARMS services. We have some limited funding to help with the one-time rental costs. I'm sorry to hear that there are people who still can't hear us. A lot of people have said they can. You might want to try to log in again or call in and go by phone. So the next question is, does the person have to have a source of funding to pay for housing, e.g. SSI, SSDI? What if all they have is GA? Can HAC or HAS help people find GRH-funded housing that does not go through coordinated entry? Okay, so yes, we can, we help people who are just on GA all the time. They don't have to be getting SSI or SSDI. They still do have to be, they have to get MA, which it won't be a problem, and then they also have to be eligible for one of those home care services. And HAC or HAS, can it help people find GRH-funded housing that does not go through coordinated entry? So the only GRH-funded housing that you could get through HAS or HAC would be GRH-funded housing that is funding rental subsidies in independent housing. If the GRH is funding housing that is in, say, a group home or what would be considered a more congregate setting, then neither program could assist people. There is, it's kind of rare, but there is GRH funded housing that's scattered sites. That's just a rental subsidy that an individual gets. And I know the Phoenix program does a lot of that. And we are able to work with that kind of GRH funded housing.
Okay, to talk about legislative things.
Oh, another question. How long does it take typically to find a placement for someone? This comes down to a few things, the most important of which is their income and then where they want to live. The vast majority of our clients at the ARC are extremely low income, living on SSI and SNAP, and occasionally some of them have MSA. For those clients who need subsidized housing, unless they have a voucher, finding subsidized housing that, say, is Section 8 project-based housing can take between 1 and 3 years. What we have done to try to address that situation is that we are no longer doing any waiting lists. We're working with everyone who calls us that's eligible. And what we've set up is a system where we, on a bi-monthly basis, are compiling the most current open waiting list of subsidized housing and getting that out to people. We've been doing that for the last 9 months, and it's starting to bear fruit for us. People are actually coming up on the list, and we're getting them moved in. When you have a waiting list like the program used to have, then they would be waiting for you and then waiting to get on a open waiting list. So we've changed that now. We work with everyone all at once. The downside of it is it's not perhaps as individual and as one-on-one as some people and their workers would like, but they are waiting in a proactive way because we get them on the waiting list. So the short answer is 1 to 3 years for people who are low income. If people can afford to rent on the market, then we start looking right away, right after the intake, or right when they want to move. And I think it's just a matter of a few months, and we can get people in. So I'd like to add a little bit about upcoming legislation and the importance for all of us who are involved in trying to find truly affordable housing for people with disabilities, the importance of us to kind of lend our voices to that effort at the city level and at the state level. The federal government is not going to be building any more public housing or project-based Section 8 housing. They are out of the housing world, and we are going to have to, as a state and on a local basis, step up for those people who are below 30% of the area median income and find a way to create rental subsidies, or the majority of people with disabilities are not going to find affordable housing. So the ARC Minnesota has gotten very involved in making part of our legislative agenda it includes housing, and working with the various coalitions and creating partnerships with people to try to make changes in a legislative way that will increase truly affordable housing.
Well, are there any more additional questions? Feel free to type in questions or comments. We'll give you a few seconds here to do that. And otherwise, we're going to wrap up for the day. As we said, let's see, so our next Housing Best Practices Forum is scheduled for February. Keep an eye out for that announcement for the next topic areas. Let us know if there's other topic areas that you're wanting to hear about and subjects that we can cover in this forum, and email us and let us know that. Apologies if some of you had trouble hearing today. We'll continue to work on that. And thanks again for joining us. It sounds like we're going to wrap up. Thanks, Ellen, so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I didn't take, I thought it would take longer. I thought there were more questions.